a countdown. Hello, hello, hello. I am never with you on Saturdays, and I am so excited to be with you here today, primarily because some of you know, if you are in Kansas City, you know my cousin Tommy Simmons, who has been fighting a conviction he had and spent several years in prison, much of that time in solitary confinement. And there was a lot of corruption involved in because he was absolutely innocent. But today I have with me my nephew's dad, Gary Hendricks. Good morning, Gary.
Good morning, Nicole. Good morning.
And Gary, for me, represents a little bit of sadness, but mostly hope, because I remember when I was a child that people would just disappear, mostly men, all of them Black, and they'd be on the block one day, and the next day they wouldn't be there anymore. And the same is true for my relationship with Gary. In fact, Gary, when I got a message from you, I feels like a month ago or so.
Right.
I honestly didn't know what had happened to you. I just knew that it had been 2 decades since I had seen you last. And if you would please, let's just, if you wouldn't mind, give people a little bit of your background. And specifically, I'd love for people to know about your faith, because that's been critically important to where you are now.
Right, correct. Again, glad to be here. Yeah, I obviously grew up in Kansas City. I am among 7 or 6 other siblings. We all, obviously grew up together. My faith started with my mom, who at a very early age, I can remember her putting us on the church bus going to a Baptist church on Paseo. And I used to think that she kind of put us on that bus so she could get some rest. I mean, 7 kids, it's a lot of kids. But my mom said, no, I wanted you to know Jesus. And so I wanted to ground you in a faith that I obviously she believed that at some point would be necessary. And so I would go to church. I would go at a young age. Well, I would admit to you, I didn't always go to church. I'd get on the bus, get off, and go to the park as a young man, a young kid. And I would always say, well, I may not be in the church, but I'm close to Jesus. I'm right there by the church. But obviously, when I would go to Bible study, we would learn about Jesus. We would be taught. I didn't get the fire and brimstone type of preaching.
Hey, Gary, let me interrupt you. It's interesting that you only mention your mother. You grew up with both your mama and your dad.
I did grow up with my mom and dad, and I was going to bring him in shortly. But my mom, the reason why I talk about my mom, because my mom for me was pivotal. She deposited so much inside of me. And, mom gives you that intimate side that you, even as a young man, that you desire. My dad more so gave me that masculine side that would develop me into becoming a man. And his role was important too. But I remember my mom sending me there. Although my parents were together, they obviously were married. They stayed together and they raised several kids. But and so I was introduced to that faith, and at some point, seeds were planted. I can't say that I accepted Christ at a young age, but I knew Jesus for me was important because that's what I was taught and that's what I was told. And in my heart, I honestly believed that he was the way. And if you ever got in a bind, if you ever got in trouble, if your back was ever against the wall, that you could call on him. That's the kind of message I received from him, and that salvation came through him. And eventually, as I got older, at some point in my life, and I'm kind of fast forwarding a little bit, I did asked Christ to come into my heart and became a born again believer.
What?
And
How old were you then?
I would say 33. I was
Okay.
33.
All
I
right.
had, well, let me just say this, Nicole. I had moments where I would go to the altar and I would repeat what people would tell me to repeat. They would say, come to the altar, you need to come and repeat these words. But those words were just merely me just, mimicking what someone else told me to say.
Mhm.
I didn't really understand it. I
Yeah.
didn't.
Gary, hold on just a second. I want to know all about your faith, but the people are joining because I told them that you spent 24 years in prison for a non-violent offense that basically amounted to less than $300. I also told them that the system was intending on you dying in prison, and you got life without the possibility of parole. You were expected to come out of there in a pine box. There was no hope for you to get out.
That's correct.
And looking at you, hearing you talk about your faith, I think is wonderful. I think because when people hear somebody's in prison for 24 years, what their biases will do is say, "Oh, it's the downfall of the black family." You grew up with both your parents,
Right.
middle class. I saw the house you grew up in. It was walking distance from my home, around the corner from my grandmother. You did not have a rough beginning from my view. So tell me what caused you to try drugs, to use drugs, to end up in this situation?
Right. So I would say at probably the age of 13 or 14 is when I started to experiment with drugs, and it started with marijuana. And then obviously I would drink some, I started drinking at that age as well. Most of that had to do with me feeling as though I needed a release or an escape. Because sometimes I tell people, sometimes you really don't know what's going on in the heart of an individual, because sometimes it's so easy to what I call masquerade or pretend to be okay, to be all right. And then there's this internal struggle. And mine was just a sense of worth, a sense of uh, belonging, validation, things that I felt like I needed that I really didn't get.
So
And
tell me more about
then
that. You didn't feel like a sense of belonging, and you didn't feel like you had a validation. Why? Was it school? Was it home? Was it what was it?
I think most of it had to do with school, just my association with people. Like I said, I came from a loving home. I felt it from both parents in very unique ways. I felt it a certain way from my dad and my mom. Obviously, I felt loved and cared for in a special way too. But I think that when I tried to identify with my place in the world, like who am I? How do I fit in? I didn't believe that I fit in with the people that I hung around with. I thought that most of the people, with the exception of one guy that I grew up with that stayed right across the street from me, Lonnie, I always thought that I had to be performance oriented. Like it's predicated on what I had. What could you bring to the table, Gary? You're only as good as what you can bring to the table.
Mm.
So I didn't think that there was a genuine acceptance of me. And at the same time, I'm trying to discover who I am, because I was never told what I could be or what I could become, or what is out there for me to reach for. And so I think it stemmed from that. I didn't think I was very popular or very attractive man, so I felt like those were certain things that attacked my self-esteem
Okay.
and my
So
self-worth.
you started numbing that with
Right.
first marijuana, then or alcohol, and then what'd you try?
And then eventually I would experiment with anything from speed to acid, LSD, anything that was mind altering, anything that would disconnect me from my emotions, what I felt, how I viewed myself, anything that would allow me to detach from that. And then those drugs would allow me to pretend to be whatever I wanted to be. I could pretend, I could have the courage to act out and be whatever I wanted to be without being self-conscious. That's what it did, because apart from that, I was pretty much self-conscious and I didn't have a pretty good, strong view of myself. So that's what the drugs allowed me to do. It pretty much allowed me to be who I wanted to be and escape those emotions and really not care what people thought, as opposed to not being on drugs, being more concerned about how people felt or what they thought about me.
You know, I care too deeply, I think, about what people think. Folks don't always know that about me, but I care really deeply about what people think. And I spend a lot of time in therapy working through that people are responsible for their own feelings. I appreciate you. I don't know that I get to see men, especially Black men, be so vulnerable. So thank you for just kind of sharing that what you were doing was numbing with substances, basically.
Right.
So I don't know where you were getting these things, but I do know, because when I met you, it was in the height of the crack cocaine epidemic in Kansas City.
Right.
Drugs just being pushed into our community. And did you sell drugs or use them, or both?
Oh no, I did not sell drugs. My objective was to use,
Okay.
and so that's what I spent time doing.
And then
Um,
it got to a point where you couldn't afford it anymore. Your
right.
habit.
And yeah, and let me say this: I was in Kansas City, and it had gotten so bad. I can remember my mom at one point saying, "Gary, you've got to get out of Kansas City." And her fear was that one day I would be killed. That
Mm,
she would read, about me in the paper, because no one knows what to do. Especially eventually, I got on crack cocaine, and no one knows what to do with people who are battling with that type of addiction. And at that time, people just didn't understand how it was affecting people, in particular, people who may not have used that particular drug or saw that drug as a drug of choice,
got
could
you.
not could not understand why would someone looking at how that drug is destroying their lives continue to engage in it. And it was hard. So I moved to Virginia, and because again, my mom didn't want me to die, and I went up there with my brother, only to continue in that same behavior, because it's said like this: wherever you go, you take you with you. And if you're broken when you leave, you take that same brokenness to another geographical
Mm,
location. It doesn't change. The places change, but the feelings don't change. And at some point, I started to engage in what I call snatch and grab robberies. I would go, and the first event, I would go into a store, and I went into a vitamin store, laid some items on the counter. Once the lady opened the cash register, I just reached in, grabbed the money, and just ran. I never wanted to hurt anybody. So one of the things I never did was carry a gun, because I said that, and no, I will never put myself in a situation where that will happen, because no one needs to lose their life because of my struggle. And
mm.
that's kind of that's how I felt. And I turned myself in on the first robbery, not because I was a good guy and had a conscience. I left my keys and my wallet on the table. As I ran out, I started reaching for them. I couldn't find them, and I said, "You know what? Let me walk on down to the station, because they got all the information on me." And in that incident, I got 5 years. Uh,
So let me get this straight. So you basically robbed the store, no gun. You grabbed money out of a register. I don't want to minimize it. How much was it, sir?
that money, I got at least about $34.
$34. And for $34, the first time you were given 5 years in prison.
Yeah, two
And you were
suspended, well,
and
three suspended. Yeah,
and you were the one who turned yourself in, primarily because you had left your wallet.
right.
And then you did two more of those. The total amount of all three was how much?
I would say somewhere close to 300,
Okay.
maybe 295, 200, 300. If best, it's 300 at best.
At best, $300, no weapon, not threatening anybody. The first time it was about $34. You got 5 years in prison. The second time, how many years in prison did you get?
I was sentenced to 10 years and had 5 suspended. So I did 5 years. I did 4 years, 4 years and 2 months, I think, or three
Okay.
years and 6 months.
So 9 years in prison. in essence, you have taken $150 or so,
At best.
total 10 years in prison. And then the third time, we're still less than $500 easy. And
Right.
they say, sir, three strikes, you're out. You should die in prison. That's what happened.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because those crimes were committed in Virginia, in Norfolk. I moved to Charlottesville and committed that last crime. And it just so happened that when I went to court, I ran into the same prosecutor that had prosecuted one of my cases in Norfolk. And he looked, I never forget it, as I went into the courtroom for the arraignment, and he looked and he says, I remember you. I remember you. And he said, you won't get away this time. You will not. You should have gotten more time the first time. So Charlottesville decided to use what they call the Virginia three-strike law. I was the first one in the state of Charlotte, or in the city of Charlottesville, to be sentenced under that statute. It had been on the books, but it had never been used, at least in the city of Charlottesville. It's interesting because they didn't even really know how to proceed, the procedures. They had issues with, how do we proceed? Do we serve him an indictment? Does it have to be added to the indictment, et cetera? So they struggled to know, and they called another jurisdiction to find out how they did it. So yeah, I was the first one that they would use the three-strike law. And he said, this time you're going to come out in a pine box. He said, I'm going to serve notice on you, and I'm going to make sure that when you come out, it will be in a pine box. Nicole, I cannot tell you how my heart was crushed. It was crushed because, yes, I took responsibility, but I also said, what did I get myself into?
Yeah.
It was tough.
You know, when I watched your video, I think, let me back up. You sent me a video of you delivering an hour-long keynote, telling your story and saying how grateful you were to the organization that had helped to get you out of prison, because you were not you were not supposed to get out.
Right.
And I remember feeling like I've never seen someone take so much personal accountability for, in essence, having a drug addiction. Because, you know, my best friend owns like a recovery house for people with opioid addictions. And addiction is treated like a mental health crisis.
Right.
It is not treated like a criminal offense. And to see that contrasted with what you're describing to me is really, really hard. And so can you help people understand? I guess it was the three strikes you're out law that ended you
Right.
up?
Right.
Okay. And they put you in a maximum security prison. Can you tell us what that's like for those of us who have no idea what that means?
Right. Okay. So let me just real quick answer the first one.
Okay.
The three strike, the reason why I felt, and obviously when you do wrong, I'm like this. My mom, my parents raised me well. So when you do wrong, I mean, I knew right from wrong. And to do that three times was hard, because sometimes you think, okay, I can get mercy the first time and maybe even understand it the second time, but the third time was very, very weighty. So it added to how I already felt. It exacerbated how I felt. And I said, man, look what I've done. Look what I've gotten myself into. So that's where a lot of the personal accountability came from. I didn't want to make up an excuse. I didn't want to, look at the system. We do need to look at it, but I didn't want to look at it because I needed to look at me first.
Okay.
And so when I got sentenced, the headline was, Gary Hendricks sentenced to life without parole. And so I'm sent to a supermax. The reason I'm sent, the supermax is designed for the worst of the worst. So you're talking about rapists, people who
serial rapists, not even just like you got to do it multiple times to end up in a supermax.
Exactly. I mean, he's repeated that behavior multiple times. And let me just say this about the statute. The statute says that what you commit has to be that it's not part of a common act, transaction, or scheme, which meaning you did it, you got out, you did it again, and you got out, and you did it again. So you have to be at liberty between those offenses. So it's not like if you commit 3 in a sequence that you are subject to the statute. It means that you served time at one point, got out, served time again, got out, and then did it again. So it was for rapists, murderers, people who were, it was for armed robbery, but armed robbery that involved violence, where someone was hurt, someone was shot, and maybe even killed. So, but here's the thing about Virginia. Virginia's statute, robbery statute, by statute, robbery in Virginia is violent. In other words, it doesn't matter what happened. If you are indicted on robbery, it is automatically a violent crime. So what they did was they said, hey, robbery's violent, and this guy's committed what we consider 3 robberies. It didn't matter if it was violent by nature, but by statute it's violent. So we can take that statute and apply it to this guy's life because he's had his opportunities. So I ended up with a supermax because I had those 3 robberies. And Virginia built a supermax prison, telling the public that it was necessary because we have the worst of the worst that needs to be there, only to find out.
So let's pause there for a moment. The state is building a supermax prison and then convincing the citizens that, one, it's needed. So, yes. So things went to vote to be able to get that. I want to make sure people listen to this.
That's right.
Folks first convince us that we need to incarcerate our citizens. That's the first point. I'm sorry, sir. Keep going.
That's right. That's right. And so they, the governor at that time, that he promoted that. He said it was necessary. We needed. In fact, they built 2. They were sister prisons, 2 supermax. So it's 23 hours lockdown, 1 hour where you get out, you shower. When I entered into the system, I probably had Nicole, because of the 3 robberies, I probably had 20. Maybe 19 points. Well, that wouldn't get me to a supermax. So what Virginia did was, what the Department of Corrections did was, they took everybody and restructured the point system. So now the numbers go up, and when the numbers go up, your security level goes up. So I went from 19 to 47 points.
Okay, so let's some of us had never been involved with prison, so we don't even know what points mean.
Right.
So there's a structure. Right. That basically you get points, and once you have a certain number of points, that determines where you go.
Right.
You, in essence, had 19 points because of the level of the types of crimes that you had committed, right. Which they can call them violent crimes if they want in Virginia. But if that robbery is not a violent crime with no weapon and right. No threat, it is not violent crime. I'm not letting you accept that. Not on my show. You can do that on somebody else's, but not here.
Right.
And so because they built these supermax prisons and they could not fill them up, what they did was change the rules, as we tend to do, right. So that they could then fill the prisons up. So your numbers, nothing about your crime changed. Right. Your numbers, they changed the rules.
Right.
The number went from 19 to 40 what?
47.
47. So now, because they changed the rules, not that you committed another crime,
right.
You now are eligible to go to a supermax prison.
Yeah, that's the only prison that I could have gone to with those points. Like with 19, I go at best a minimum security prison.
Okay.
So you go from level 6 all the way down to a level 1. So with those 19 points, I would probably ended up at a level 3.
Okay.
Something like that. So the points were raised, and so I ended up at a supermax. And the supermax is, I tell you, walking in there for the first time, a lot of the things that you go through, you're embarrassed, you're put to shame, you're told to strip. They're filming you on cameras. Dogs are there, guns are in the tower, and so this was like no other experience I had ever had. I walked in and they had newly built this prison, so. You had to walk in a straight line. Any attempt to embrace someone was considered an act of violence. People would walk around with weapons and various things because it was a very hostile environment. It was new for me because even though I had committed those crimes, I was not a violent person. Again, uh, I wasn't out there hurting people. I just wanted to support a habit, and I tried to take the path of least resistance. At least for me, was to snatch and grab, or as best I could. But yeah, I ended up at a supermax, and I stayed there for 6 years. Um, it was tough. It was. You really had to take care of yourself, and anytime be prepared to defend yourself if you had to. Whether you were a violent person or not, you knew that if you were going to survive, you were in an environment where it was really the surviving of the fittest. You had to do what it takes to make it through that. And still, I had to make choices. I had to make choices when I was in there. I had to decide. I mean, you have gangs, you have various organizations, people who get together, who claim to be this, various cliques. And so in that environment, you still have to make a decision. And I'll tell you, it takes courage to make a decision in an environment, a prison environment that has a code. This is the prison code. And so you have to decide how much of that you're going to buy into. Some of it you have to accept in order to survive, but not all of it. So it was a very unique experience. I made it through, but I tell you, it was very challenging.
We'll save the details for the book I'm going to help you write. But for now, I really am interested in. You told me about the prosecutor deciding that you're not going to get away with this. In essence, saying not caring at all
Right.
about the fact that this is a drug addiction. You're not a criminal. We understand that now when the drug is disproportionately impacting people with white skin. But when crack cocaine was disproportionately impacting people with black skin. And so therefore it was like, we have no empathy for that.
Mm.
Can you tell me about the judge in your case?
Yeah, it's very interesting because, and I remember the judge like it was yesterday. It was very interesting because at that point, because let me just say this, because when legislators write laws and enact laws, they do it with an understanding of what is already practiced in that state. So when they wrote this statute, one of the things that they did was they actually gave the prosecutor power to utilize that statute whenever he wanted to, and then at the same time simultaneously tie the judge's hands. So he was nothing more than a facilitator, because the statute didn't allow him to, uh, even if he felt like by nature my crime wasn't violent, normally a judge would have the power to come in and say no. But the way this statute was written, his hands were practically tied. So what he had to do is just go through the process of, is the burden of proof met? Is it three or more subsequent offense that was not part of a common act transaction scheme? So he had to watch that process unfold. At one point, I did ask the judge, at least my attorney, we did say, hey, look, this is not a violent crime. At least look at the spirit of it, not the letter of the law, but at least have a consciousness to say, let me evaluate, let me look at this and see if this is in all actuality violent. He said that he was not given the power by the statute to do that. So he was pretty much, again, he was like a facilitator. Wasn't much he could do,
Yeah.
but listen and say, is the prosecutor meeting his burden of proof? Does he fit the criteria for this statute? And if so, my only thing is to say, we'll go forward with it and allow the jury, because I didn't take a bench trial, which would be the judge deciding. I took a jury trial.
Because you thought a jury of your peers was going to be helpful. I want to just ask those of you who are watching, give me some kind of emoji to let me know whether or not you think this is right or wrong. I know that everything legal is not right and everything illegal is not necessarily wrong. But clearly here, you all have to have some opinions, those of you who are watching. If you think this is wrong, let me see an angry face emoji. Give me something on the screen to give me some sense of what you're thinking. And if you believe that this was the right thing for the state of Virginia to do, then go ahead and give me some kind of thumbs up or something. But I think, Gary, I know, I I won't say I know. I have heard when judges are like, well, I don't necessarily know that this is right, but this is the law. And then they continue to move forward with, for in your case, a life sentence without the possibility of parole, meaning you were supposed to die in prison. Now, you decided to do a jury trial, and you thought for sure that the jury of your peers would see this and come up with something else. Tell me what happened.
Well, actually, Nicole, this is why I took a jury trial. At the time when the prosecutor informed me that he would be seeking, he had to give me a notice. He said, I will be seeking the Virginia three strike law. At that point, I took a jury simply because let's say I had went in and said, uh, don't do it. I'll just plead guilty and we don't have to go through this trial. Well, he still had the power because within that statute, it says that even if I confessed, if you go into it deeper, it says even if I would confess, he could still invoke the three strike. He could still give me life without parole. So I was conflicted.
And he had already told you you're not going to get away with it this time.
He had already told me I wasn't going to get away with it. So I said,
you're
man,
not going to get away with basically having a mental health condition. But let's keep going.
right. And so I took a jury because I said, I'll let them if they find me guilty, fine. Maybe someone will look at this statute and say, this doesn't make sense or this is unfair. Well, maybe he should have gotten some time, but it definitely doesn't raise to the level of life without the possibility of parole. That was my hope, that someone would at least see it, because I thought that obviously I knew that I would be found guilty. I knew that. The evidence was insurmountable. It was a lot of evidence. And I said,
and then for people who are just now joining us, you had already done 9 years in prison.
Had already done that
for having a drug addiction. These crimes were to fund your drug addiction. You hurt no one.
No one.
Got it. Okay.
I had mentioned one time that, and I'll go forward, that one of the other reasons why I didn't want to carry a weapon, because one, I didn't want to hurt anybody. I wasn't raised that way. And number two, I was hoping, because I was depressed, probably, suicidal. I was hoping at some point that someone would take me out. And I said, well, if anybody should lose their life, it should be me. Mm-hmm. And I felt like no one should lose their lives or get hurt at my hands, because I needed a fix on drugs. So, so basically the jury was my hope to say someone would see it. But you got to realize I had a jury of 12 with one black man. And so the rest of them were white. And so they struck most of them. So
let me just ask, in the county where you were being convicted, was that the demographic makeup of the county? Was it Absolutely. Less than 1%? No, no, it was like 30% black, right?
Yeah. Right.
But your jury was less than 1%, or I'm sorry, less than 10% black. And you got this one black man on the jury.
Right. And yeah, and he was defined by the prosecutor as being a wild card. Because I believe that for him, he saw, I think in my heart, I believe he said, this guy he probably should get some time. He should get some time, but not this statute. And so the deliberation was lengthy. And I think that he was one of the ones who held out until I believe that it came to a point where he just kind of acquiesced or whatever, just said, the majority's out there. But yeah, that was a makeup. I raised the Batson motion. A Batson motion means you're challenging the makeup of the jury and you're saying that it is prejudicial, that it's prejudice. It doesn't resemble the makeup of society or where the area I live in. So they went through the Batson motion, and obviously it was denied, uh, and it was rejected, and they said that this was a fair uh, this was a fair
Representation of your peers.
representation, and that there was nothing done out of the ordinary, because prosecutors do what they call striking for cause, and you can strike people. You have an opportunity to strike, I think, 4 people just because you want to.
Just because you want to.
Yeah.
What's interesting is I have spent a decent amount of time in Virginia. And if there's, and this is just my bias with my small sample size of the Black people I get to interact with in Virginia, it's almost like the social arrangement is understood that if I am going to survive here, I'm not going to cause too many waves. White folk know what white folk know. Black folk know kind of, not that we agree with it, but we understand our place. And in order to live here and to be able to make it, I'm just going to go along to get along.
Right.
So that juror was kind of in a bad spot, right? Like if he's anything like what I'm describing in my experience, and I'm talking like this year,
Right.
we're talking 25 years ago, he was in a bad spot. He was picking you or him, basically. How
Right.
is he gonna live in that community
Exactly.
after you want gone? So the prosecutor said you're not gonna get away with this. The judge say there ain't nothing I can do. The jury was a jury not of your peers, and you have never said to me, Nicole, I didn't do it. You say yes, I did 3 snatch and grabs. All of them amounted to less than $300. The first one was $34, and you did 5 years or so in prison. Gary, life was your rock bottom, right? Like you stopped doing drugs immediately. You did not do drugs in prison. I understand, right?
Right. That's correct. That's correct. Um, I mean, my life had come to a screeching halt. It was tough because, uh, and I'll admit, there were days I would wake up and I would look around, and I would look at my circumstance, and I would sometimes allow those circumstances to define who I was. Like, you're a failure. This is the best you can do. Look what you got yourself into. And I didn't look at the system as much as I did myself, because I wanted to make sure that I was looking at the man in the mirror.
Mm.
I knew that there were some issues with the system, but that wasn't for me nearly as important as me understanding that I had made some decisions that landed me in a situation that allowed me to be uh, caught in this adversarial system. Like the prosecutors, their job is to be adversarial. That's what they're trained to do. Like,
Mhm.
even though I can look at him, I'm saying you are trained to do that.
Yeah.
And if this is an opportunity to promote your career, to patent your resume, to get you, started to say, hey, man, I was the first one to convict this man under the 3-strike law, fine. So I couldn't really look at other people as hard as I could. So life without parole, I broke down and cried, obviously, because I said, man, he said I'd come out here in a pine box. And I said, I'm not that guy.
Yeah.
I did some things, but that's not who I am. And so there were days
And we understand that today, though. We understand it today, which makes me think we actually understood it 30 years ago. If the opioid crisis was impacting Black people, I know this is not your way. This is what this was probably this position probably would have kept you in prison. So I don't even want you to adopt it. But you practice what I call like extreme ownership. There's a book about it. Like you're like, look, I did some things. You just don't even you never really look at the system. And the reason I asked you, I said, hey, will you come on with me? Because I want to talk about in my work, I talk about the personal, and it matters. And it's really hard to get people to move personally, because it took a long time for you to get to where you are right now. But then there's the culture that we all create, the behavior and how we view each other. And as US citizens, we really do need an empathy revolution. We need to understand that there are things that we do that cause people that to feel numb, to feel like they don't belong, to feel like they don't have dignity, right? And we all own that, not just Gary Hendricks. And then this system is corrupt. The system is corrupt. A prosecutor can do whatever they want to do. I'm telling you, my cousin was innocent, and the prosecutor knew he was innocent. The police knew he was innocent. So did the president of the police union. And guess what? What they did, they arrested him and then put him in solitary confinement, so he couldn't even talk to anybody about it. And so I know you're like, it's not helpful to you, Gary. I know, while you're sitting in prison, to think about the system. That's not going to help you. I've read there's a book about happiness called, oh gosh, Sean Anker wrote it, and I can't think of the name of it right now. But he's like, the people who are the happiest in the world are the ones who take personal accountability for their lives. And so that's how I know, when Marshall says that, Devoya says that, it's good to see your strength in your current state. I know that's because of the personal accountability that you take. And so I'm not trying to get you to change it.
No.
What I am trying to do is to get the rest of us to understand that it is truly how we treat each other that make these things possible. And when we support law and order and we need prisons, that's how we get to a United States that has incarcerated more citizens than any other country on the globe.
Right.
And so for that, I want to commend you, because I told you many times over that I am so impressed with how much personal accountability you take. And I want the listeners to know that, yes, thank you, LaDonna, that this is a damn shame. That prosecutor ain't never going to spend a day in jail for doing what he did. Never. But you spent 24 years and you weren't supposed to get out. How'd you get out, sir? How did it happen? Because you weren't supposed to.
Wow. I spent years. I think at 10 years, I had a mental breakdown because I continued to look at the reality of my circumstance. But I guess after I'd done like 23 years, there was a rumor that there was a particular law that had come into play. And what happened was this guy had challenged, because Virginia doesn't even have parole at all. Okay. Now, you may have what they call people who are under the old law, where they had parole before, so they were grandfathered in. They still had that parole availability. But Virginia had went to 85%, so there was no more parole. And so one guy in 2000 went to trial for armed robbery, and took a jury trial, challenged the constitutionality of not informing the jury that parole was abolished in Virginia. And for years they agreed, but it was never retroactive, meaning it would go from that point forward. And anybody who was affected prior to that was just stuck. Mm-hmm. So I fell in the group of people, well, at that time, it wasn't many, who were just stuck at the fact that it wasn't retroactive. So after 23 years, they brought it back up before the General Assembly, and at which point, under new administration, this governor decided, and this group of General Assembly guys and women, they decided that it should be retroactive. Well, you got to remember, I had petitioned the governor for a pardon. I had gone through that process, saying that I just didn't think that life without parole was fair. Got turned down repeatedly. So I took all of my transcripts and all of my information. I threw it in the trash, really almost out of frustration. But there was a part of me that felt like God said, get rid of this stuff, man. If you're going to get out, it's going to take my power to do it. So I threw it away prior to that. When this statute comes up saying that anybody who took a jury trial and the jury was not informed that parole had been abolished could qualify for parole. So I'm looking for my paperwork. I said, man, I threw everything away. And it was just so happened that this one woman who I had been interacting with that had mailed out legal work for me had a copy. got in touch with her. And at that point, I was able to read my transcript.
Oh no, you got to tell the story. You called her and you said, "Tell them what you said."
Okay, I did. All right. Okay. So I had informed her that I said, look, the Lord told me to throw that paperwork away. I threw all my transcripts away, etc. And I was just really sharing that with her. And I said, man, but there's this law that's coming into play, and I don't have my transcripts and or anything. She said, well, look, the Lord told you to throw yours away, but he didn't tell me to throw mine away. I was like, hey man, I said, boy, I could have reached through there and hugged you several times. I was excited. I was full of joy. I said, could you please send that paperwork in? So yes, she sent it in and I got it. And eventually I brought it before the board. And one of the things I want you to note that know is that while incarcerated, I did everything I could to improve myself. I did whatever program I had to go through. I took a few vocational courses. I got an associate's in theology or my associate's in Bible. So I got 2 of those degrees, and I got some vocational training while I was in classes that I wasn't eligible to take, but because they saw that I just wanted to. And there were a lot of courses I took because I just wanted to keep moving forward. I wanted to keep thinking that it mattered. I wanted to make my life count. So
can I pause you there just for a moment too?
Yeah.
So we give people life without the possibility of parole. Mm-hmm. And then because they're never going to get out, we assume, why bother allowing them to improve themselves? They're useless, basically.
Right. And it was a challenge for me to get those programs. I had to go over and beyond to say, hey, look, at least let me do something that gives me some sanity. Like, let me continue to feel as though I matter. And after pushing, they allowed me to. Any rate, there were a lot of people. I went to a group called Kairos, but there were a lot of people who saw my work. There were a lot of people I reached out to that just basically couldn't do anything. And they knew me. And at some point, when they realized that I had an opportunity, they sort of galvanized together and started to talk to people that they could talk to, send letters out to people. And so this overwhelming flood of letters and support came as a result of this window being open, because just because I was going up didn't guarantee I would get out.
Right.
It just meant that I had an opportunity to go up.
A woman I admire, Trish Rojo Bushnell, told me the system's not designed to let people out, even if you're innocent. It's just not. Once you're in it, it is so hard to get out of it.
Oh, the wheels turn real slow.
They're not trying to let you out quickly.
they were not trying to let me out. In November of 2020, I discovered that I was eligible. In March or in February of 2021, I went up for parole with 4 people. Well, 5 people. All 5 of those people got turned down. And when we all went up, they went up a day before me. So when they got turned down, I tell you, Nicole, I'm going to tell you what I did. When they all 4 got turned down, I felt hopeless. I went to my room, got in my bed, put my pillow over my head, and I cried like a baby. I said, man, because when the doors have been closed for so long and then someone breathes hope and you want to embrace that hope, and then you start to look around you and saying that they don't care. They're not letting anybody out. So I started to measure myself up against the people who had went up with me. And so it was so emotionally painful that I had to go, as a singer called Life, he says, crying is like taking your soul to the
laundromat.
And yes. So I had to go wash. I had to wash it. I said, man, I can't hold this. And I'm sure my cellie was up top. We were pretty close. So I know he didn't mind. He knew what I was going through. And I went and I cried and I got myself together, talked to the Lord. And I said, just give me the strength to go through this. And eventually I didn't hear anything. I didn't hear anything for months. March went by, April went by, May went by, and then June came. And June 16, I was in the chow hall, which is the cafeteria where we eat. and this counselor came up and said, "Hey, you got a minute?" I said, "Yeah." "You all right?" I said, "Yeah." "You sure?" And then at that point, I said, "Well, he's got some kind of news." I said, "Man, what is it? What do you want to tell me?" And he said, "Sit down." And he turned the paper around to me, pushed it to me, and I looked at the paper, and it said, it said, whew, it said you've been granted parole. And I was numb. I couldn't believe it. I was numb. I just put my head down. And so when I walked back into the cafeteria, everybody was silent because they knew why I went in that room. And that's the one thing, if no one else has anything in common, if you are what they call a likable person or a person of character, people by and large in prison care. They care. And I walked out of that room and everybody was silent. They was like, and then one guy just walked up to me and said, "Man, okay, man, tell me. I can't, it probably is none of my business, but what happened?" And at that point, I'd say, my buddy used to say it this way. I said, "I cried the second coming of Noah's flood." I cried so hard that, and I didn't care who saw it. Sometimes you get to a point where you don't care.
Yeah.
And I cried and I said, "Man, they released me. They let me go." And you got to remember, I was the first person in years. Pocahontas was open for 13 years. I was probably the second person that ever walked out of there on parole.
Pocahontas, for those of you listening, is the name of the prison where Mr. Hendricks was.
Yeah. And I tell you, I cried. They said, and I remember that guy telling me, he said, "You would never come out of here except for the pine box." And to be honest with you, at some point, I believed him. I believed him because I couldn't see any way out. When all the doors are shut and you can't see a way out, sometimes you have people who will try to breathe life into you, but at some point you have to believe it for yourself. Mm-hmm. People can only carry you so far. And at some point you have to grab a hold of that hope and believe. And I think that there was a little bit of that there. And then finally I got granted parole, and I was paralyzed. I didn't know what to do. I said, "I've been down 24 years. I don't know. What do I do? Like, how do I start?" I know I wanted to be out of prison. And dude, that walkway I walked through, I used to dream. I used to see people go home, mandatory sentences. I used to dream of making that walk one day. And I think I sent you a clip. I don't know.
Yeah, you did.
And the only thing I had was a box. And there were a few people whose lives were impacted because I always believed that there were young men, young Black men who were in there, young men, period. And I always wanted to invest, to deposit, to give something back. And I was walking out of that. I was walking down that walkway, and it was an out of body experience because I couldn't believe it because I only dreamed about it. And finally, my day had come, and I ended up walking out of prison. Didn't know what to do. Didn't know what to say. I told you I went and got my medical records and started shaking because I couldn't believe what was getting ready to happen. And I was walking with this CO, and she said, "You're probably the second out of all the years I've been here, the second most emotional person that I've ran across. Because when you've been down and when you've been broken and when you've been told things that would never happen, and when you can only dream about being somewhere, being with family, because prison has a way with the life sentence without parole to put things in perspective. You value what's important. You know what's important now. And you get an opportunity to do that. And then life says, God says, "I'm going to give you another chance. I'm going to give you not a second chance, because I already burnt that up. Mm-hmm. I just need another chance."
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I walked out of there, went to Hardee's, did not know what to order. I'm sitting up there like a deer in the headlight.
When you went to prison, Hardee's didn't have all the options. It wasn't, the screen didn't move. And right. For 24 years, you didn't get to choose what you wanted to eat.
Not really. You had some access to what they call canteen, but the selection was limited. So you were always told what to eat, when to eat, and how much time you have to eat. I always said that I look in that tray sometimes, and I used to sometimes call home and I say, "Look, I can't eat that stuff that's in there. You have no idea what it is. It's tough." And like, because sometimes people say, "Oh, at least you get 3 square meals and a place to sleep," and I said, "Well, you know,
It's not
you
quite
have
3 square meals.
yeah, you
It,
don't have
it's
any idea."
something. Yeah, it's something. You know, I you were telling me some things about what it's like to try to integrate back into society. When you went to prison, no one was even really using cell phones in the way that we do. There
Right,
were pay phones on the corners. People had pagers. There are probably people listening who don't even know what some of these things are.
right.
We still had phone books. Um, the internet was not. We were not using the internet, and so now you've got to come out and people are like, "Oh, apply online," and you're like,
Right. Well, and again, you have to realize that I had life without parole. So there were programs that were not available to me. I could not, you're buried alive, really. With a life sentence under the new law, I was really on death row. I just had the long-term plan. There was no set date. That date would be determined by whenever I expired. So they weren't offering anything to me that would help me uh, acclimate back into society, because they said, you have life without parole. We're not investing in you. We're going to spend 200 and something $1,000s a year on you or whatever, but we're not going to invest in anything because you're a dead man walking.
mm-hmm. It was one of the listeners today. I don't remember who said it, but basically that it was Devoya, that they earn too much money keeping you in prison. It's a very profitable business to incarcerate our own citizens. And there's, it's very interesting because even when I say that, I say, yeah, there are some people making money, but what does it do to us as a collective society to treat people in this way when in essence what we had was a heart problem, not
Mm.
not a criminal problem. Gary, what are the 3 things you think people should know? Because we've kind of come to the end of our time here. What are 3 things that you think just everyday citizens need to know so that we are not supporting these types of legislative actions?
I think number one, it's important to be educated on our legal system. So often we don't really get involved until it reaches our front door. Like, we don't really look into it until it affects something that's close to us. I think as a society, a group of people, we need to be more educated on these laws that are being passed and how they are affecting, in particular, Black men and people of color. Um, I'll say this because, see, when that statute was enacted, I already had 2 strikes. So really, they enacted a statute that would automatically affect a large group of people right away. They already had them. So it wasn't like the law was in effect prior to those offenses. It's like, okay, I already got 2 strikes. Let's enact a law that now
You do
you've
one
already,
more thing. If you do
yeah,
one
you,
more
you
thing,
do you do one more thing, you're going to prison for the rest of your life. So
forever.
I think it's important to not only be informed and educated, but to be involved. That is to write our congressmen, to write those who are responsible for enacting laws, and challenge some of those things, how they're written. Um, Sometimes we just need to go down to our judicial system, to our courtrooms, and look at those cases and watch how they prosecute those cases, and be more informed. And I think that another thing is one of the things I was told, and I believe this, Nicole. Uh, yeah, I take a lot of personal responsibility, but we have to educate our young people and keep them out of this web.
Like, don't even get in the system because
Don't
the system
let's
ain't
catch you
right.
right,
The system ain't right. So in the meantime, we can talk about what's fair, what's not fair.
right.
It's gonna be unfair, and we're gonna be in prison trying to prove that it ain't fair.
right.
Yeah.
Because if you're poor, and I had a public defender who had no interest at all in defending me to the highest level. I mean, at best, he was giving me minimum a subpar a defense. So you're not getting the best. If you, I mean, everybody's not getting a super team. You know, everybody is not getting someone who would challenge the law. So I would say to do that, and then as we can coach and involve and and teach our youth and connect with them at a young age. Some of them are out there lost. Some of them are out there thinking that this is the only way.
Mhm.
We have to put boots on the ground, and we have to go through the highways and hedges, and we have to get involved. We can't stand on the sideline. We
Mhm.
have to enact organizations. We have to galvanize to get this message out to say, first of all, it's unfair, but number one, we have to stay out of this web. It's almost like teaching our young black men what to do when you're stopped by the police. Hey, these are the things you need to stay calm. You need to not be sometimes we talk with our hands and it's considered an act of aggression.
Yeah.
Some of it's just that we black anyway, and so we're already classified as being uncivilized or
Yeah.
whatever the case may be.
From a very, very young age. Listen, I can't tell you how grateful I am that you spent this time with me today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I I just thought it was really important, at least for the people who think it's important enough to follow me, to hear what happened to you. Um, I think it's important for them to hear that the most disruptive are the most disrupted. There's a
Mm,
sister who wrote a book called Push Out. That's not my quote, but when I read Push Out, that's what sticks out to me. That the things you were doing were a cry for help. I'm glad you're clean. I'm grateful that you're clean. I'm grateful that you reached out to me so that you, after when you went to go see my nephew, your son, because I learned a lot too. And I just hope for everybody who's listening, you should know that Mr. Hendricks is doing keynotes. And if you want you want to have a keynote about hope, he's doing keynotes, and I'll share contact information for anybody who wants it. But at the very least, just understand that when people are saying law and order, it is, thank you very much, Anisha. It is a system devoid of integrity and delivering
mm,
justice. That's what it is.
yes.
If we want to do better, we have to imagine what would we want to happen if it were us.
Right.
And when you have an illness, you do not expect to spend life in prison. You expect to be healed. And so, Mr. Hendricks, I don't know what tomorrow brings for you or for me for that matter, but for today, I appreciate you sharing your story with my listeners. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Nicole. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.